Hello everyone and welcome back. In this lesson we're going to go through using and refining interactive selections in ArcGIS. You've already used select by attributes and select by location, but we haven't used interactive selection where you can manually control exactly which features get selected visually very much at all. Together, this set of selection tools make up a very powerful feature, but knowing each part is important. So in this lecture, we're going to show you how to use all of the interactive selection tools to manage your selections, add to them, remove from them, and control what is selected. So let's get started. First, the interactive selection tool is right up here. You've probably seen it up in the toolbar, but we haven't really used it much. So if I click on this, by default, it selects a rectangle, and I can just click on individual features to select, and it will select them for me. But I can also click and drag a box, and will select all of the features in that box for me. By default, if I make another selection, it creates a new selection and removes the old one. But if I want to add to the selection, I can hold down the Shift key and do the same thing again, and it will select both areas for me. I can achieve that same result of adding to my selection by going to the Selection menu and going to Interactive Selection Method and selecting Add to Current Selection. So if I do that now, I'm not holding Shift anymore, but if I select something, it adds. Now that I'm in Add to Selection mode though, if I hold down the Shift key and select a currently selected area, it will remove parts of the selection that are already selected, but it will add to the selection when I am over areas that aren't selected. Now I'm going to add another layer to this map so that we can see a little bit more about the behavior here. And I'm going to clear the selection using the Clear Selected Features button so we can see more. And what I want to demonstrate is that the selection activates on any feature class that is underneath the selected area. So if I select this, it selects features both in the Census Places layer, but also in the Protected Areas layer. And if I pan down here, we can see that the edge of this large polygon from the Protected Areas layer I just added is selected, but so are all these census places. If I wanted to confirm, I could also check the attribute table for which records are selected. Another way to work with that, though, is to go to the List by Selection view in the table of contents. So instead of listing layers by their rendering order, we see them by selection, and we get counts of the number of selected items. So I can see that there are 78 census places records selected, and 141 selected in the protected areas. Now, if I wanted to only select from the census places still, I could now just clear the selection in the protected areas layer, and now I only have a selection on the census places layer. I can also make this not selectable anymore. So I can toggle it so it's no longer selectable. It pops down into that not selectable headline. And now, even if I try to select it, I can't until I toggle it back on. And once again, I can select it. We can see with the outline of the selection. A really quick way to make that happen if I only have one layer I want to select is I can right click on the layer and go to Selection and make this the only selectable layer. And if I toggle back to the table of contents, I can see that while this layer, the Protected Areas layer, has a selection active, it's no longer selectable because that's grayed out. So if I cleared the selection, it pops down to not selectable because we already did that over on the other table of contents view. Some other handy things when you're working with selections, you can right click on a layer that has a selection active, and instead of just zoom to layer, we can go to Selection, zoom to selected features, and quickly get those features in our viewport. It makes selecting items from the attribute table, but also interactive selection, really nice and easy to go see what you're looking at. So let's take a look now at the other selection modes. If I go to Interactive Selection Method, I can create new selections as we've been doing. I can add to selections, remove from selections, and then I can select from the current selection. So let's choose that now. And if I select an area that's not selected and an area that's selected, I get just the features I touched that were already selected. So I barely touched the corner of Chicago over here, but it selected it anyway. And that's because you don't have to get the whole item in your bounding box. You just have to barely touch it. So let's zoom in over here, and I can demonstrate that a little more clearly. So if I was to draw a box now, it wouldn't work because I'm only selecting from the current selection. So I have to switch back my interactive selection mode to create new selection. And I can draw the whole bounding box and it selects it. But if I clear that selection and I barely touch it right here, the item is still selected. So let's zoom back out and let's switch selection options here. So I've been using the rectangle. I can also draw polygons. So I can click and create points of polygons to select within. And when I double click, it finishes the selection and selects any features that are touched. I can similarly select by lasso. So instead of a polygon, I can just hold my mouse down and kind of draw around anywhere I like and get a selection that way. I can use a circle, click and drag, and it makes a circle for me. And I can select by line. So click and drag, double click again, and do that. The circle makes a nice opportunity to demonstrate using some of these in combination though. So let's make a relatively big circle here with a selection and select a lot of features. And then I'm going to hold down the Shift key. And let's say I wanted to not select the parts at the center of the circle. I can click and drag again, the center of the circle, and with the Shift key, I can remove those features again. So I start to get fine-grained control. And if I really wanted to, I can then select my rectangle again and start zooming in and hold that Shift key down and remove individual little features in here. Now, again, what you noticed when I did a little bit too careless of a selection is that I accidentally added features. And if I really wanted to focus on removing features for a while, I'd go to selection and then go to remove from current selection. And then I don't have to hold down the Shift key, and the only thing I can do is remove features. If I click on features that aren't selected right now without holding the Shift key, I don't end up with them selected. So the best way to really do those refinements is to switch the selection mode. Now, the last thing we can do here is, if I go back out, is let's start imagining ways to combine our selection tools into workflows. So let's start by selecting the boundary for Chicago here. We're looking at town boundaries, and I forgot to change back to create new selection. So if I select the town boundary here, and let's say I wanted to know all of the other towns that share a boundary with Chicago. Now, I could zoom around and manually select those right now, but that's not the fastest way. So I interactively selected a feature of interest, but if I go to selection and select by location, remember that select by location can only use the selection, or only use the selected features down here. So I want to select features from census places where the source layer is also in census places, and in this case it forces me to use the selected features because that's the only way it won't select everything, right? Is if I select from a layer where the selection is the rest of the layer, it's going to select all features. So it uses the selected features, the one feature, and what I want is I want to know when they share a boundary. So I can do touch the boundary of the source layer feature down here as the spatial selection method. If you didn't take the last class and this is confusing for you, I recommend you go and take the previous class and look at the lectures on selections in there, because I go through this much more thoroughly in there. And if I click apply right now to finish this selection, I get all of the features around Chicago that share a boundary with the city of Chicago. And I can do this again if I want to. So now I have 36 features selected. If I want to keep growing this in some sort of organic, touching way here, I can click apply again, and it grows it again and again. And finally, if I wanted a new layer from this selection that would work just for the rest of this map document session, I could right click on it. I could go to selection, and I could select create layer from selected features. And up here, even if I turn this off, and I'll turn off the protected areas to make it clear, I can see that I have a new layer that was only those selected features. This can be useful for chaining your selections in an analysis. If I want to make sure I kind of get a checkpoint before I continue making more complex selection, that's really useful. And it doesn't write anything out to my hard drive, so I don't end up with all these additional layers with different names filling up my hard drive. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. In this lecture, I showed you the basics of using the interactive selection tools and managing those selections in the table of contents, and how to add, remove, zoom to your selections, and use different types of selection tools to get at the features you're interested in. See you next time.